You ever think about how passwords are kind of terrible? You visit a website for the first time and just to get started, they ask you to come up with a new password. And it's just not fun, and coming up with secure passwords is often a struggle for a lot of people. So what ends up happening is people use the same passwords over and over again, making them basically not secure because if one gets compromised, they're all compromised. Either that or they have to pay for a third party just to manage their passwords for them. And if not, people also often forget what their passwords are. So that means you also need to implement the ability to reset passwords. So what if instead we just got rid of passwords? How would we pull that off? Well, we can send magic links. Basically, we'll email a specific link to a user that only our server can generate and expires after a certain amount of time. That means the user just needs to provide their email address. They'll get in their email, they click the link, and they're in. So that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to implement a passwordless authentication in NestJS using magic links, and then I'll also show you how to keep track of the user sessions using JWTs. Alright, so as usual with my videos, we're going to create a new application from scratch so that you can follow step by step exactly how to do this. So I've got a terminal open here on my desktop. I'm using Node 18, npm 8, and then make sure to install the NestJS CLI globally if you haven't already, and then we're going to use that to create our new application. So we're going to do nest new and then a project name. I'll just call it passwordless. Pick your package manager of choice. It'll start installing for you, and then once this is done, we'll open it in VS Code. Actually, while we're still in the terminal, go ahead and cd into your new directory, and then we're going to install a couple packages. Now I'll talk about each one of these dependencies as we actually use them in the tutorial. Right now we can open this in VS Code. So we're going to do nest generate module users, and that's going to create us a new users module, and it's also going to hook it up to our root app module. And then we'll also do nest generate service users, which is going to add a new user service inside our users module. Within the users directory, we're also going to create a new file, user.entity.ts, and this is just going to be a simple class that will represent the shape of our users, right? So it's pretty simple. We're just going to have an ID, an email, and a name. All right, next open up user service, and here we're going to create a mock database of our users. So we'll create an array called users, which is going to have a type of user of the entity we just created. And then we'll just fill this in with a couple mock users, Mumbo and Dumbo, and that'll be our initial users database. All right, to wrap up the user service, we're just going to add a simple method here that allows us to find a specific user based on the given email. So we'll have a method find one by email that takes in an email string and simply iterates through the array and finds the one user that has the matching email. Right, so this pretty much lays the groundwork for us to be able to tell, which users are already registered and can actually log into our application. Now, this user service is going to be used in other places later on in this tutorial, so we have to make sure that this is actually in the exports array of our users module. All right, now we need to start laying down the foundations for our authentication logic. So we're going to create a new module for auth. And in fact, we're just going to do nest generate resource auth. Select REST API for the transport layer and no for the CRUD entry points. This is basically going to do the same exact thing as users, except now we also have an auth controller. All right, so before we write some code, let's actually try to talk about the design of our API. What are we trying to implement? So if you're familiar with NestJS, you should know that controllers are in charge of defining routes for your application. So if it has auth here, that means that's a prefix for all the routes inside the auth controller. So let's say that we're trying to implement a post/auth/login, and the request body of that is going to contain the email inside it. Now, our expectation is that when you call this, what it's going to do is make sure that you're a user and then send you a magic link. And then imagine that a user gets that magic link in their inbox and then they click on it. Then we need some kind of callback API that intercepts that click. So we're going to do a get/auth, and let's just do login/callback. And then part of this request is actually that it's going to have the token as part of the request query. And then the idea is, we take that token, we make sure that it's valid and that it's not expired. And then we create a JWT that we can send to the consuming client. And then finally, we respond with a generated JWT as basically the access token for our application. Now you might be wondering, where does this JWT access token, come into play into our application? Basically, we're going to use that to keep track of user sessions, and we're going to expect that any route that is protected is going to check for that access token in the headers. So for example, imagine that in our app controller, we can add another route in here, and we'll just call this get protected. Right, so this is basically defining a route on /protected, and we're saying that we need to require a JWT here, otherwise we should reject the request. Right, so we'll add a to-do here to make sure. We'll come back to this later in the application, but for now, let's go back to our auth controller and implement these routes. So starting with login, we're gonna do post login, and then the method itself can be called login. And then similarly, we'll do get login / callback and callback. Clean up our comments a little bit, and then make sure to import these decorators actually from NestJS common. All right, and then we'll actually go ahead and implement these one at a time. All right, so let's quickly talk about how we're actually going to generate these magic links and send them to users. Earlier, if you remember, we installed Passport, which hopefully you're familiar, but basically it's like an API that allows you to plug in different types of authentication strategies. So you can see that. So for example, maybe you're trying to do old school username password or passwordless or OAuth, right? You can swap the different strategies for your application while still using mostly the same API. So that's the benefit of Passport. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a very specific strategy for Passport that will allow us to do passwordless authentication with magic links. So remember, we installed Passport Magic Login. Actually, notice that the author here is Max, who is one of the authors behind Style Components, if you're familiar with that in the React ecosystem. So at a high level, what this strategy allows us to do is if you give it an email, it's going to generate a custom login URL for a user. You can see, for example, here they have /auth blah 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 token, and this token is actually a JWT, which is a pretty clever solution if you think about it, because JWTs are designed to be signed using a specific secret that only your server knows. And then built into JWTs is also the ability to add a specific payload in there, like user information. Plus, it also has in its specification the ability to add an expiration to that JWT. So basically everything that we need for a magic link, right? The ability to expire it after a certain amount of time, the ability to make sure that only our server can create it, and also the ability to encode specific information about the user in that URL. Everything is basically handled for you within a JWT, right? So basically we don't have to worry about storage, which is really nice. All right, so now we're going to go back to our code, and basically we're going to get this strategy configured in our application. So what we're going to do is in the auth directory, we're going to create a new file, call that magic login.strategy.ts. And this is going to be a class called magic login strategy, which extends passport strategy. And then in here, we actually need to pass in the strategy that we're trying to implement. So we're going to import the strategy from passport magic login and then pass it in here. And then we're going to make this an injectable. So from NestJS's perspective, this is basically a provider. And since we're basically just extending the strategy, that means that we can configure it via the constructor. So within the constructor, we're going to add a call to super here. And then we're going to pass in the options for our strategy within that. And if you need a reference to understand what are the properties that you need to pass in, just go back to the documentation of any strategy that you're trying to implement. For example, in our case here, we need to pass in secret, callback URL, send magic link, and verify. So first, let's add a secret. This is basically what's used to encrypt your information into the JWT, and only your server should know this. So this should absolutely not be exposed publicly in any way. Also, it shouldn't even be hard-coded in a code like this. We're just doing it here for simplicity, but make sure to, move this out to environment variables, for example, so that it's not just hard-coded, right? Again, keep this secure. This is very important. Next, we can pass in JWT options. So like I mentioned earlier, the token that we're creating for our magic links is really a JWT, and you can configure the options for that JWT. For example, at what point does it expire? So that basically means if your token is expired, your whole magic URL, magic link is expired. So we're going to define an expires in. And for this, I recommend something, fairly short-lived, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. You definitely don't want it to be available for like an hour. So let's do expires in 5 minutes. Next, we're going to define a callback URL, and we say that that's going to be on /auth/login/callback. Now in production, you might not necessarily be running this on localhost 3000, so make sure to change that to whatever you end up using in the real world. Next, we're going to define a send magic link option, which has a signature like this, takes in a destination and an href. The destination is basically, the email that's provided. So this is effectively where our magic link is generated, and this is also where you can send that into an email. Now, how you send that email is really up to you. We're not going to cover that in this tutorial. That's a little bit out of scope, but you got a bunch of options to pull that off. So for example, maybe you're using AWS, they have an email service, or maybe you're using some other third-party service, or if you have like an SMTP server, you can use the node mailer package, right? So there's a bunch of different ways that you can send emails. Again, that's a little bit out of scope for this tutorial. So what we're going to do instead is I'm just going to add a logger here, and then we'll just kind of mock that send, right? So we'll do this.logger.debug, and we'll just output that to the terminal. We'll say, sending email to destination with the link href, and then that's going to basically simulate for us as if we sent an email to, I don't know, some user's Gmail account, but it's going to show up in our terminal so we can just access it there. So the last option to define here is a verify callback, which is invoked when, the user clicks on the link, and then our application looks at the token, verifies that it's correct. After that, the verify callback is invoked. So we need to provide a verify here. Now let me talk about this real quick. In NestJS, typically if you read the documentation, if you're trying to configure strategies, what you usually expect is that within your password strategy, you have a validate function, which is supposed to be equivalent to basically what the verify callback is. And if the strategy, the library was written correctly, this method is actually going to be invoked automatically. However, that doesn't happen for this magic login library. So we're just calling this.validate with the payload. That way we just forward it down here. That way we can follow the typical NestJS pattern with passport, which usually has the validate method down here. And you'll see that later on too when we implement the JWT strategy. So what this payload is basically think about it as the JWT that we get in the URL. If it's valid, it gets decoded, and whatever information is in that JWT, in our example, it's going to be the destination or the user's email. That's going to be inside the payload. So that's going to be provided over here, right? So you can imagine that this payload has a type that has destination in it, and that's a string. Now, as the name implies, we need to do any final validation on this payload before we let the user actually continue with their authentication flow. So in here, we need to validate the destination, or basically the email, to make sure that this is a valid user. Now, this logic of basically having to validate that the user exists and is a user of our application, or otherwise throwing an error, that's logic that is going to be reused in a couple of different spots in this tutorial. So we're actually going to centralize that logic into the Auth Service. And remember that the Auth Service is a provider, so that means we can inject that into the constructor here. So we're going to do private Auth Service and make sure to import Auth Service. And then what we're going to do down here is basically we'll just do this.auth service validate user. We'll pass in the email in there, and then if it is valid, it's going to return us back a user. Otherwise, it's going to throw an error. And this is giving us the red error here because we haven't actually implemented that. So we'll do declare method validate user, which is going to add that to our auth service, but obviously we need to implement it. All right, so to implement this logic, remember that we already built the logic around finding a user based on their email. So that's in the user service. So we're going to inject that provider into this service. So we're going to do private user service of type user service. So make sure to import that. And then remember that destination is really the email. So we can just rename that for clarity. And then we'll use that to look up the user with that given email. And if we don't find a user, we're going to throw an unauthorized exception. Import that from NestJS common. Otherwise, if we did find a user, we'll just return that. All right, so pretty simple logic. Now, real quick, in order for this injection to actually work, we need to make sure that the auth module is importing the users module. And then remember that the users module is exporting the user service. So that's how we're able to basically use a service from a different module. All right, so with all that in place, going back to our magic login strategy, basically we just need to figure out how to invoke this strategy within our login route so that effectively the send magic link gets invoked and then produces us our login link. Now remember that this is an injectable, so it's a provider. So we also need to make sure to register this in one of the modules. So we'll do that in the auth module. Make sure to provide that in here in the providers array. Also make sure that you're importing the local one, the one that we created, not the one from the library. So this is basically our own extension with the configuration in it. All right, with that in place, with the strategy registered, like we said earlier, we basically need to invoke this send logic. And the way to do that is if you look into the class of the strategy, you'll notice that it actually exposes the send method here, which takes in the request and the response. And that's what ultimately triggers the send magic link that we provided down here. And then it'll automatically fill in with the information of the destination and the href. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our auth controller, and now we need to actually truly implement this login route. First of all, we need to inject the strategy in here to make sure to import the magic login strategy, again, the local one that we have. And then we said that we basically need to invoke the send from that class, which requires the request and response, which you can actually get access to from Nest using a couple decorators. So we're going to do rec and res from NestJS common, and we're just going to forward that down here. At this point, we're actually ready to run our application for the first time and make sure that what we have so far works. So in the terminal, run npm run start dev, and you should expect no errors here if you've been following along. Now, while the application is running, I'm going to open up the Thunder client, which is sort of like a Postman, but you can use it in VS Code. And you should be able to make a request to localhost 3000, and that's going to return hello world. That's just from the default code that generated. Now we said that we also have a /auth/login, which is a post. Let's try and make a request to that. It should say that we need to actually pass in a JSON, which is correct because it's expecting an email. So within the body, we need to provide destination and then some email address. And now when we hit send here, you might have an error in the bottom here. And if we look at the terminal, you'll notice that it's because it's erroring out on this the underlying send code, which is expecting the send magic link to actually return a promise because it's going to do .then over here. So to fix that, that's pretty simple. We just go back to our send magic link inside the magic login strategy and just change this to async, which is correct because, you know, think about it. If it's sending an email, that's an asynchronous operation. All right, now we should be able to again go back to our request, post/auth/login, hit send with a destination of some email, and we're gonna get back 201 created. And if we look in our terminal, we should be able to see that log that we created earlier that says sending email to this address with the link. And you can see that it has that full URL that we have /auth/login/callback with a token attached to it. Now, if you're paying close attention, you should actually expect that this is the wrong behavior because we said that this should only work for users that are already registered in our application. And within our mock users, that's not even one of the emails that we have here, right? So we actually expect that to fail. Now, what we can do to do this validation up front is to simply extract the email from the request. We can use the body decorator here. And then since we already have the auth service injected in here, we can just call our validate this.auth service.validate user. And that should throw an error if the user was not found, even before it runs this send logic. So if we make the same request again, this is actually going to come back as a 401 unauthorized. But if we switch this to one that is a valid email, mambo@email.com, hit send there, then we're back to it being okay, right? So now we kind of have a little bit of validation in place. Now this is assuming that you're not using the same method for signups. You could, if you wanted to add sign up logic in here, like for example, maybe you just want to get the user up and running very quickly with just the email. That's fine. You can add sign in logic here, but that's a little bit out of scope for this tutorial. Now there's one more piece of validation here that would be really nice to have, which is ideally if the email is not even a correct email pattern, we should just send a 400 request back and don't even try to validate it, right? So for example, if I, send something gibberish like this should just straight up fail. Instead of just saying unauthorized, it should tell us, hey, that's not even an email. And that's pretty easy to do. Basically, we're just going to introduce a DTO file. Let's call this passwordless login.dto.ts. And then we'll just create a class that represents a request body. So that's going to have destination in there. And then we're going to use class validator. Remember, we installed this in the beginning. And we're just going to annotate this and say that this is supposed to be an email. Now, if we take this and go back to our auth controller and provide this in here as a type to the body, all we need to do now is in the body decorator here, we can add new validation pipe. This is one of the built-in middlewares in Nest that allows you to, validate your DTOs. So now if we go back to our request with the gibberish email, if we hit send here, now this is going to return a 400 bad request and it'll say why, right? So this will be very useful for a client application to do the email validation for you. And then just checking again, if we do provide a valid email address and an existing user, it should get us back that 201 created, right? So at this point, if you remember in the terminal, it is logging out that callback URL that we basically are going to send via email to the user. Now we need to actually invoke our callback URL to make sure that this token is valid. Right, so what that basically means is we go back to our auth controller and then we need to actually implement the logic for this callback. Now, most of the logic that we actually need here is basically already contained within this strategy, right? Like we said that it defines when the token expires. And then this also has the validation logic in here. So basically, we just need to find a way to invoke this strategy for our controller. And the way you do that with Nest is usually through the use of guards. So we're going to do use guards, auth guard, and make sure this is the one from NestJS passport. And this takes in a string, and we're going to say magic login. And what is that? Basically, this is saying, hey, Passport, get me the strategy that has this name, which is the one we're using here. And it's going to invoke that strategy before it actually goes through and finishes the rest of the request. And then finally, once this piece is done, we would just return the user, right? And that user becomes available inside request.user. So if we take the request here again, you'll find that let's just return the user. If we do rec.user, this is actually going to contain the user that we returned down here. All right. And before we test this out, actually, I have a very small typo here. This should be login/callback, not logic. All right. So let's go ahead and test our login again. Let's do post on /login. Destination with our email should get back a success. And then remember, we're printing out the login URL inside the terminal. So you should be able to copy that and make a request to it. You can just paste it in the browser. In my case here, I'll just open up a new request and then make sure that's an HTTP GET, hit send, and notice that we got back Mumbo, our user record. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Let me walk through again what is going on. So we log in, the strategy creates us a magic URL, which is this, which contains a JWT, and that JWT has in it encoded the user's email, which is the destination. So it's basically this is the payload just encoded into the JWT. And then when we make a request to our callback, it parses out that token out of the request. It validates that it hasn't expired yet. And then it also uses the secret to make sure that, this is valid. It has a valid signature. And if all of those passes, it decodes the token that we have here and then calls verify with the payload. So the payload here is the decoded token that we have in our URL, which right now all it contains is the user email, right? So all it has is the destination. So in order to get the full user record, we basically do another lookup. And then we simply return the user, and the way Passport and Nest is hooked up to work, basically what you return here becomes automatically provided within the request.user here. So that's how we're able to access who that user is. And now this user is effectively logged in. All right, so at this point so far, all the code that we wrote is what's allowing us to create and send magic links. And if that's all you care about, you can pretty much stop right here. But real quick, I'm going to show you how to set up JWT so that we can keep track of the user session that, we know that they're logged in using an access token. All right, and to do that, basically what we really want to do is after they do the callback here, we don't necessarily want to return the user record. What we really want to return here is a newly generated access token or a JWT that will basically allow us to say, hey, you're now logged in. You can use this access token to access any of our protected routes. So instead of just returning the user here, what we're actually going to do is we'll do Auth Service .generate tokens, and we'll pass in the user in here, the request.user. And this is not implemented yet, so let's do the declare method again. All right, so here basically we're passing in a user, and then we need to generate a JWT. Now, how do we go about doing that? So let's go back to the auth module, and we're gonna register a couple of things in here. In the imports, make sure to add passport module, which is gonna be important later. And then for right now, we actually need to do JWT module, which is coming from NestJS JWT. Remember, we also installed that earlier in the video. This is the module that basically is going to expose us a method that creates and generates our JWT. So make sure to do register here. And this is where you can configure the various options for your JWT generation. So for example, you also need a secret in here. Again, same thing. Make sure you're pulling this from environment variables. Don't expose it to your clients. Keep it secret. For this tutorial, I'm just going to provide, a simple string. And then finally, you can also provide a sign options here, which is where you can configure things like expires in, sort of like what we use in the magic link strategy. It's pretty much also using the same library behind the scenes. So here we're going to say that this one will last for an hour, right? So our sign in, the JWT that we use in our login links only lasts for 5 minutes, but the access token, once they're actually logged in, will last for an hour or however much long you want this to be. So this is basically the length of your user session. Now, what this JWT module exposes to our auth module here actually is a JWT service that we can use to create tokens. So back to our auth service, we're going to add dependency here in the constructor, private JWT service, which has a type of JWT service from NestJS/JWT. And then this generate tokens method actually should be below the constructor here. Let's move that down here. And then now all we need to do is construct some kind of payload. And you can put whatever you want in here. Typically, you need to provide a sub for the ID. So we'll do user.id. And then let's just add the email in here. It's up to you what you want to add to the JWT payload. You might want to keep it small though. All right, so once we have some kind of payload, now we can just create our JWT. Let's do return access token. And then we'll use our new JWT service to sign our payload. And this basically should return a JWT. So let's go back to our Thunder client. We're going to need to log in again. And then let's get back our new login link. And let's replace our request here, which was expired already. Hit send. And now we're getting back an access token. All right, so we're pretty much almost done. The only thing left to configure is, remember, we have this to do here in our protected route that says, hey, require JWT, right? Like right now, if you make a request to get/protected, it just lets you in because it's not protected in any way. Now what we need to do from here is just like how we added a strategy for, our magic login, we just need to add a strategy for authenticating a route with JWTs. That's what Passport JWT is for, which is also another thing that we installed. So the process for that is very similar to what we did before, which is basically kind of like how we have the magic login strategy here. We're going to do the exact same thing, except we're going to do JWT strategy.ts. And in the interest of time, I just pasted the code in here. You can pause the screen to copy it, but it's the exact same thing that we did before. We're going to do JWT strategy, extending the strategy from passport JWT. And then within the super, we're going to configure a couple things in here. Basically, we're going to say that the bearer token, the access token that we have, expect that to be in the auth header. Make sure to not ignore the expiration. And then we also pass in the same secret in here. This needs to be the exact same secret that you provided in the JWT module over here, if you remember. So you can kind of imagine that this strategy is going to take the token and then it's going to check the signature of that to make sure that it was correctly signed using the same exact secret, right? So that's why the secret here needs to be the same as the one that we used to sign it, because this is the one that we're going to use to verify it. And then, like I said before, typically what happens with strategies is that it's automatically going to invoke the validate function here with the payload, right? So imagine we have the JWT that gets verified, it gets decoded, and once decoded, the payload of that is going to be passed into validate, right? It's very similar to what we did earlier with the magic login, except that we don't have to do this manual this.validate call. It's going to be called automatically for us. And then similarly in here, we're just verifying that the user exists, maybe because, what happens if the user got deleted in between the requests. So we're just going to validate the user again and then return that user. And then remember, when the user is returned here, it becomes available inside request.user. So with this in place, just like before, we need to register this within a module. So go back to auth.module, add it to your list of providers here. So you should have JWT strategy. And then at this point, we should be able to go back to our root app controller. And in here, we can add use guards, just like before, auth guard from NestJS passport, pass in JWT. And then just a reminder again, whatever you return here inside the validate effectively becomes exposed under request.user. So if we do rec here again, we can change our return statement here to be, maybe let's return the name and say you're in. Let's go ahead and test our application. Just to do the end-to-end flow again, let's go to auth/login, hit send there, go to a terminal, get our login link, and then we'll do a get on that callback. You should get back an access token in the response. Now we're going to take that access token. We're going to go back to making a request to get/protected. And remember, if we hit send here, it's going to say 401 unauthorized. But if we go to auth, provide this as a bearer token. This is basically the authorization header. If we hit send here, now we're getting back a 200 OK, and it knows that that token was from Mumbo, right? So it validated that the user is logged in and also pulled up their user record. So now they have access to this protected route. So pretty much we're done. We now have the ability to log in without passwords and also maintain a user session using JWTs. Alright guys, so that's pretty much it for me today. Hopefully you found this tutorial useful in some way. If you got any feedback, let me know in the comments. Do you think you'd use this in your application? What thoughts you have? Anyways, make sure to like the video and subscribe if you want to see more of these. And hopefully I'll see you in the next video.